Disclaimer: this story contains mature themes intended for adult viewers. Viewer discretion is advised. The room felt warmer than it should have, though the window was slightly open and the evening breeze slipped in like a quiet witness. I remember the exact moment everything shifted, the way his chair scraped softly against the floor as he pulled it closer, the sound sending a shiver up my spine. It wasn't loud, but it was deliberate. Intentional. I didn't turn around immediately. I couldn't. Instead, I focused on the rhythm of my own breathing, trying to steady it, but my chest betrayed me, rising faster, heavier. My fingers tightened against the fabric beneath me as I became acutely aware of every inch of space and every inch that was no longer there. Then came the silence. Not empty. Not awkward. Charged. The kind of silence that hums between people when something unspoken hangs in the air, waiting to be acknowledged. I felt it before I saw it, the closeness. The presence. The shift in energy that made my skin hypersensitive, like every nerve had suddenly awakened. My heart pounded so loudly I wondered if they could hear it too. A soft exhale broke the stillness behind me. I turned slowly, almost hesitantly, and that's when our eyes met. There was something in that gaze. Not confusion. Not hesitation. Understanding. And something else, something deeper. A silent permission. Or maybe a challenge. A faint, almost teasing smile tugged at the corner of his lips, and suddenly the air between us felt too thin to breathe. I swallowed hard. This wasn't how the night was supposed to go. Or maybe it was exactly how it had always been leading. Another shift of movement behind me, closer now. The faint brush of presence, not quite touching, but close enough to feel. Close enough to make my thoughts unravel. My pulse raced. My body stilled. And in that fragile, suspended moment between choice and consequence, I realized something that changed everything. I wasn't being watched. I was being seen. And just as I opened my mouth to speak, the door clicked. The sound of that door clicking shut didn't just break the moment. It echoed something much older, something buried beneath years of silence we had both learned to live with. Because the truth is, this night didn't begin here. It didn't begin with a glance or a shift in a chair. It started long before, in the quiet spaces between us. We weren't always like this. There was a time when just the brush of his hand against mine would send warmth rushing through me, when late-night conversations stretched into sunrise, filled with laughter, dreams, and the kind of closeness that felt unbreakable. Back then, we didn't need anything else. We were enough. But somewhere along the way, enough started to feel like routine. It wasn't sudden. That's what made it harder to notice. It crept in slowly, missed glances, conversations cut short, touches that became absent-minded instead of intentional. We still loved each other, at least, that's what we told ourselves. But love, I began to realize, isn't always the same as connection. And then came the silences. Not the comfortable kind we once shared, but heavy ones. The kind that filled rooms and lingered between us even when we were inches apart. Nights where we lay side by side, staring at opposite walls, both awake, both pretending not to be. I started noticing things about him. The way his eyes would drift, not out of disinterest, but curiosity. The way he hesitated before speaking, like there were thoughts he wasn't sure he was allowed to have. And if I'm being honest, I felt it too. A quiet restlessness. A question neither of us dared to ask out loud. Until one night, we almost did. We were sitting across from each other, just like this, but different. Softer. Safer. A glass of wine in my hand, his fingers tapping lightly against the table as if searching for the right words. Our eyes met, and for a brief second, everything was laid bare. Do you ever feel like he started, then stopped? I smiled faintly. Like something's missing. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. That was the first crack. After that, things changed in ways that were subtle, but undeniable. We began testing boundaries, not physically, not yet, but emotionally. Conversations grew bolder. Jokes lingered a little too long. Eye contact held just a second longer than necessary. And then, others entered the picture. At first, it was harmless. Friends. Shared laughter. Lingering looks that could be dismissed if needed. But underneath it all was something electric, something that made my pulse quicken in a way I hadn't felt in years. And the strangest part. He saw it. He didn't turn away. He didn't stop it. If anything, he leaned into it. Which brings us back to now. To this room. To this moment. To the space between us that feels more alive than it has in years. The air shifted again, heavier now, not with uncertainty, but with anticipation. My fingers curled slightly, my breath catching as I became aware of how close everything had become, how far we had already gone without even realizing it. And then I felt it. Not a touch, but the promise of one. And this time, I didn't pull away. The air had changed again, but this time, it wasn't subtle. It pressed against my skin, thick with everything we hadn't said, everything we had allowed to grow unchecked. I could feel it in the way he shifted behind me, no longer hesitant, no longer uncertain. And somehow, that confidence made my chest tighten. I turned slightly, just enough to catch his expression, and what I saw there made my breath falter. There was curiosity, yes, but layered beneath it, something sharper, something possessive. My pulse quickened. For a brief second, doubt flickered through me. Not fear, but awareness. The kind that makes you realize you're standing on the edge of something you can't easily step back from. And then, I noticed him. Across the room, silent until now. Watching. Not intruding. Not interrupting. Just there. His presence shouldn't have mattered as much as it did. But it did. It shifted the balance, turned something private into something shared, something heavier. I could feel his gaze, not invasive, but steady. Curious in a way that made heat rise to my cheeks. I glanced back at my husband, searching his face for hesitation, for a sign that this had gone too far. But there was none. Instead, his jaw tightened slightly, his eyes flickering between me and the other man, not with anger, but something far more complicated. A tension that spoke of boundaries bending, not breaking. Jealousy. Not loud. Not explosive. But there. It lingered in the way his fingers curled, in the subtle shift of his posture as he leaned forward just a little more, closing the invisible distance between us. As if reminding himself, or me, of where he stood. And yet, he didn't stop it. That was what made my thoughts spiral. Because if this crossed a line, why wasn't he pulling me back? Why did it feel like he was waiting to see how far I would go? A soft movement from across the room pulled my attention again. Just a step. Barely noticeable. But enough to send a ripple through the space between all three of us. Closer. My breath hitched. Every instinct told me to step back, to break the tension before it snapped. But my body didn't move. My feet felt rooted, caught between restraint and something far more dangerous, something that whispered instead of warned. Curiosity. Desire. Freedom. I swallowed, my voice barely above a whisper. We should stop this, but even as the words left my lips, they didn't feel true. Because no one moved. Not him. Not me. Not even the man slowly stepping closer. And in that suspended moment, where silence stretched just a little too long, I realized something undeniable. We had already crossed the line. The only question left was how far we were willing to go. The hallway felt narrower than before, as if the walls themselves had shifted to close in around us. Every step I took echoed just a little too loudly, my heartbeat matching the rhythm as I tried to steady myself. I didn't know if I was walking away, or being drawn somewhere I already knew I wouldn't resist. Wait. His voice low, controlled, stopped me instantly. I turned slowly, my breath catching as I found him standing there, closer than expected. The distance between us had vanished so quickly it made my thoughts blur. For a moment, neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. There was something in his eyes now, something unguarded. Not the quiet curiosity from before, not the restrained tension. This was different. This was intent. You felt it too, he said softly, not as a question, but a certainty. I opened my mouth to respond, but the words tangled somewhere between my thoughts and my lips. because denying it now would have been meaningless. Everything about tonight had already said enough. A faint movement behind him pulled my attention, and there he was again, watching. But this time, it wasn't from a distance. He had followed. The realization sent a wave of heat through me, unexpected and impossible to ignore. My gaze flickered between them, my pulse quickening as the space between all three of us shrank to something almost non-existent. No one spoke. But everything was happening. The air felt heavier, charged with something that made every breath deeper, every second longer. I became hyper-aware of the smallest details, the way his hand flexed slightly at his side, like he was holding himself back or deciding not to anymore. The way the other's gaze lingered, steady and unwavering, as if waiting for permission that had already been given without words. And then the lights flickered. Just once. But enough to shift everything. A soft laugh escaped from somewhere, quiet, almost disbelieving, and it broke the tension just enough to make it sharper when it returned. Because now there was no pretending this was accidental. No pretending this wasn't exactly where we had all been heading. I took a slow step back. Not to leave, but to breathe, to think, to decide. Yet, even as I did, one of them stepped forward, and the other didn't stop him. That was the moment it became undeniable. This wasn't hesitation anymore. This was permission. My heart pounded as I looked from one to the other, the weight of the moment settling deep in my chest. Every instinct, every emotion, every unspoken desire collided at once, leaving me suspended between control and surrender. And just as one of them reached out, everything went still. Because the door behind us began to open. The door didn't just open, it interrupted. All three of us turned at once, the fragile tension snapping into something sharper, more exposed. My breath caught as the figures stepped inside, their presence instantly shifting the balance of the room. For a moment, no one spoke. And then, my husband exhaled. Not in shock. Not in anger. In relief. That was the first twist. I turned to him, confusion flooding my expression, my pulse racing for an entirely different reason now. You knew. My voice was barely steady, caught somewhere between disbelief and something deeper, something that felt dangerously close to realization. He didn't look away this time. I didn't just know, he said quietly, his gaze steady, almost searching mine. I needed to. The words hit harder than anything else that had happened tonight. Needed. As if this wasn't an accident. As if none of it had been. A silence followed, but it wasn't the same as before. This one was heavier, filled with truths that had finally surfaced, refusing to be pushed back down. I shook my head slightly, trying to piece it together. All of this was planned. Not planned, he replied, stepping closer now, his voice calm but filled with emotion. But, understood. There's a difference. My chest tightened. Because somewhere deep down, I did understand. The late-night conversations. The lingering glances. The way he never stopped anything, never pulled away, never once asked me to draw a line. It wasn't indifference. It was curiosity. No, more than that. It was trust, twisted into something unfamiliar, but undeniably real. I saw the way you looked at life lately, he continued, softer now. At yourself. Like something inside you is fading. And I didn't want to lose you to silence. His words cracked something open in me. This wasn't about betrayal. It was about everything we hadn't been brave enough to say. I glanced toward the others, toward the quiet presence that had somehow become part of this unspoken story. They weren't intruders. They were mirrors. Reflections of the parts of ourselves we had hidden, suppressed, or feared. And this, I whispered, my voice trembling slightly, this was your answer. No, he said, stepping even closer, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made everything else blur. This was the question. The room felt smaller now, but not suffocating. Alive. Every emotion surged at once, confusion, vulnerability, curiosity, and something undeniably powerful that pulsed beneath it all. My heart raced, not from fear, but from the weight of what this moment meant. Choice. Not his. Not theirs. Mine. And just as I began to respond, just as the words started to form, fragile but ready, one of them stepped forward again. Closer than before. Close enough to change everything. My breath caught. My thoughts scattered. And in that single, suspended second, I realized the final twist wasn't what had already happened. It was what I was about to choose. The room felt impossibly still, though the air was thick with everything that had just happened. Every heartbeat echoed like a drum, reminding us that nothing could be unsaid now. There were no more secrets, no more silences to hide behind. Every glance, every word, every subtle movement had carried us to this point, and now the consequences demanded to be faced. I took a step forward, my hands trembling slightly, but my gaze was steady. The others, my husband, his brother, and the quiet observer who had silently become part of this tangled story, watched me. Their expressions were a mirror of my own conflicting emotions: curiosity, fear, longing, and something else. Acceptance. "I can't pretend anymore," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, but carrying the weight of everything. "We can't ignore what this did, what it showed us about ourselves." My eyes flicked to him, my husband, and I saw the raw truth reflected there. He had known the risk all along, had allowed it, and had somehow trusted me enough to let it unfold. That trust, fragile and intoxicating, hit me harder than anything else. He nodded slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing just enough to reveal vulnerability beneath the control. "We didn't plan it, but we can decide what it means now." His words weren't just an explanation, they were an offering, a chance to rebuild or redefine what we had. The brothers' gaze held a quiet intensity, not threatening, but challenging. He had played a part, yes, but he had also been a reflection of hidden desires that had been too long ignored. And yet, there was no accusation, no demand, only a shared understanding that the lines we had crossed were irreversible. The fourth presence, once an observer, now seemed almost protective, almost willing to step back, letting the two of us reclaim the story that had spiraled beyond control. I exhaled slowly, realizing that this resolution wasn't about punishment or blame. It was about acknowledgement, honesty, and the courage to confront our emotions fully. I stepped closer to my husband, the tension between us now charged with clarity rather than uncertainty. "Whatever happens next," I said, softly but firmly, "we face it together. Or we don't face it at all." He reached for my hand, the smallest gesture carrying immense weight, and I felt the fragile line between desire, trust, and love solidify into something tangible. The others shifted slightly, stepping back, leaving us a space to breathe, to decide, to rebuild. In that moment, I understood that closure didn't mean the end of excitement. It meant choosing intentionally, fully aware, with hearts wide open. And as our hands met, a shared smile passed between us, filled with the promise of a new chapter, one tempered by honesty, daring, and the recognition that love, complicated, messy, intense, was always worth the risk. The tension that had defined the night finally began to dissolve, like sunlight melting the edges of a stormy cloud. The room, once thick with unspoken desires and daring risks, now felt lighter, soft, warm, alive with a quiet intimacy that was almost sacred. My hand still rested in his, and I could feel the steady warmth of his palm grounding me. Every heartbeat between us seemed to echo in perfect harmony, a rhythm that spoke louder than words ever could. We didn't need grand gestures or confessions now. The vulnerability, the honesty, the shared acknowledgement of our fears and desires had created something far stronger than any dramatic moment could. I looked into his eyes and saw everything: trust, devotion, and an unspoken promise that no matter what challenges came our way, we would face them together. "I never realized," I whispered, my voice soft but sure, "how much we had, until tonight." He smiled, brushing a stray strand of hair from my face, the gesture gentle, deliberate, and filled with tenderness. "Sometimes it takes letting go to see what truly matters," he said, his words carrying a depth of love that made the room feel warmer, the air more charged, not with temptation this time, but with connection. I leaned into him instinctively, resting my forehead against his chest, and felt the steady beat of his heart beneath my ear. Every worry, every uncertainty, every shadow of doubt that had haunted us now seemed distant, replaced by the certainty that we were exactly where we needed to be. The others watched quietly, not as intruders, but as silent witnesses to the rekindling of something beautiful. They didn't move forward, they didn't need to. Their presence now felt like a natural frame to our story, a reminder that life was more layered, more complex, and infinitely richer when lived with honesty and courage. He wrapped his arms around me fully, pulling me close, and I felt a shiver of contentment run down my spine. Not the kind that comes from risk, but the kind that comes from finally arriving, finally allowing ourselves to be fully seen, fully known, fully loved. In that quiet, glowing moment, I realized that love wasn't about perfection. It wasn't about flawless boundaries or seamless control. It was about trust, vulnerability, and the courage to step into the unknown together. And as we held each other, our smiles soft but genuine, I knew that we had created a bond that could weather anything. The night outside was dark, but inside, we were luminous, two hearts beating together, steady and sure, surrounded by the quiet strength of connection, respect, and enduring love. And in that warmth, I felt it clearly. This was our beginning, not an ending.